Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It's Monday, December 14th, and we are here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0811, Ordinance restricting the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles. This matter was sponsored by Councilors Ricardo Arroyo and Andrea Campbell and was referred to the committee on June 17th. The committee held a public hearing on this docket on Monday, August 10th, 2020, and a working session on Thursday, November 19th, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th executive order modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law, we are hosting this working session on Zoom. This allows us to do our jobs, but also balance the current public needs and concerns. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will also be rebroadcast later on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and FiOS 964. Just going to do a quick summary of the conversation we've had so far. Then I'm going to allow for our councilors who are present to make opening statements, starting with the lead sponsors. And then we're going to go back into what I consider working session's goal and get into the language of what's before us. So at the hearing on August 10th, the committee heard from Deputy Superintendent Kevin McGoldrick, Bureau of Field Services for the Boston Police Department, Superintendent William Ridge, Bureau of Field Services, Boston Police Department, Rasan Hall from the ACLU, Massachusetts, Dr. Rahini from Physicians for Human Rights, Jeff Pure from National Lawyers Guild. The committee discussed injuries and trauma resulting from these agents, Boston Police Department specific weapons, protocol, and experience with the use of the agents, and eyewitness reports of use of these agents in recent months. Public testimony was heard from individuals who experienced and witnessed the use of crowd control agents in Boston during the recent Black Lives Matter protests. Concerns were raised about the ordinance's waiting period in terms of the announcement, not the legislation of police in the field, and lack of exceptions or exigent circumstances was one of the concerns expressed by the police. At the working session on November 14th, the committee heard again from Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick, Rasan Hall from the ACLU, and Jeff Pure from the National Lawyers Guild. Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick shared several concerns about the department, most specifically about the requirement to give 2 warnings 2 minutes apart without exceptions for defense or self of others. He also noted that the BPD already focuses on de-escalation and only uses these tools as a last result. Mr. Pure and Mr. Hall reiterated points from the hearing that the ordinance codifies use of these tools as a last result. BPD was asked to bring to this working session language that would codify their current practices so the committee can work toward a compromise. I'm going to turn it now over to, again, as I stated, the lead sponsors of the matter and all of my colleagues to do any brief opening remarks. And then again, we're going to get to work in this working session. First, I'm going to go ahead and announce the colleagues. I'll just go ahead and have the lead sponsors go, and then we'll go in order of arrival. The lead sponsors, again, are Councilor Ricardo Arroyo and Councilor Andrea Campbell. You'll take it away, and then I'll announce the order after that. Either one. Councilor Arroyo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief so that we can get right into it. This is the second working session. We had a hearing on this, and I would note that, when we constructed this ordinance, myself and Councilor Campbell, we had a discussion as to whether or not we would put forward something that was a complete ban or something that was rather real restrictions. And we made a compromise to do real restrictions, understanding that that would be a compromise, that BPD, that the city, that the votes may not have been there to necessarily pass something that was a complete ban. And so in that framework, what we put together was an ordinance that puts real restrictions that protect people, that protect residents, that protect people who may be in the city of Boston at any given time when some decision is made to use these. And the reason for that is, I think it's important to ground the fact that when we use tear gas canisters, when we're firing that into crowds, when we use, kinetic impact projectiles, like unfortunately in 2004, there's a possibility or a chance that we are causing severe life-altering injuries or even death. And so every time a decision is made to do that, I believe, and I know Councilor Campbell believes, that that needs to be done with specific restrictions and with specific rules of regulation that make it clear and codify exactly what protections we're asking for. And here where we're asking for warnings to the crowd, where we're asking for announcements as to what's being done, so that people have a chance to move or leave, where we're asking that behavior be ongoing and continuous, for them to do something that may take a life or cause permanent injury. We think that's appropriate, and I certainly think it's appropriate. So I look forward to getting this done today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Campbell. And then just for my colleagues' information, order of arrivals, Councillor Braden, Councillor Mejia, Councillor Michael Flaherty, and then Councillor Michelle Wu. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Councillor Arroyo, for your partnership on this. I think he summed it up well. I won't belabor the point. Looking forward to getting this done. Of course, talking through any proposed amendments. But thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership here.
Thank you very much. Councillor Braden.
Thank you. I keep my comments brief. Looking forward to the conversation this morning and considering any changes that might be put forward, but really hopeful that we can get this done soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia.
Well, good morning, Madam Chair. Happy birthday to y'all. So just really quick, big shout out to the lead sponsors. I'm ready to get to the matter at hand and to the work ahead, and I won't belabor the point. I think this is due time, and let's get beyond the weeds here and let's pass this through. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Flaherty.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Obviously, thanks to the sponsors and to those participating. It's good to see Kevin this morning as well. Just want to make sure that we're trying to do something that's fair and reasonable. It'd be great to be able to do it in partnership with the police department, making sure that they have the tools necessary to obviously keep themselves safe and the public safe, and that there's fair warning to, I guess, unsuspecting peaceful protesters. We saw a lot of peaceful protests break down. There were people there with best intentions, but they also were, there were a lot of folks there that were not up for best intentions, and as a result of which we saw what we saw unfold. So that said, I would love a discussion at some point to talk about bringing back the mounted unit. The mounted unit has been to date our best crowd control tool, if you will. And unfortunately, previous administration and one of our former commissioners decided to give those horses away. I believe they went to New York, but nonetheless, it would be great, in addition to the conversation we're having about sort of crowd control and what's appropriate and what's not. The mounted unit served the city with distinction, and we should be having a discussion about bringing back the mounted unit as the best crowd control tool available for us. And so anytime anyone wants to have a discussion about the mounted unit, I'm happy to do that. But I think it should be part and parcel with this discussion here is with respect to crowd control mechanisms and things that we're going to use to control the crowd. Horses should be a big part of that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to echo the gratitude to the sponsors and that we are moving into a working session to advance this issue. So I'm eager to be here and grateful to everyone for their leadership and movement on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that unless there's any other councillors that I'm missing. Oh, Councillor Sabi George, I apologize. Councillor Sabi George has joined us.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm looking forward to the continued conversation today and the work before us. I will unfortunately be in and out of this hearing, but we'll do my best to tune in as much as possible. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make sure everyone got the most recent working session draft. This is to everyone, the colleagues. Has anyone have the language before them? This is a working session. I just want to make sure everyone had the language. If not, I'll just.
Got it.
You got it
this morning, yeah.
You got it this morning. Okay, good. So I just want to make sure we're all working from a draft. I am happy to turn it over to if there's any brief comments, suggestions, right on the language to our guests today. And then I'm going to have the lead sponsors kind of walk us through it again. So Superintendent McGoldrick, if you would like I don't know if you have any language suggestions, concerns that you want to get into. Then we'll turn it over to Jeff. And then I see Rasan is also here as well.
Morning. Thank you for having me as part of this working group. My concerns essentially remain the same as they've been from the inception. Unfortunately, this weekend has kind of highlighted my concerns. You know, at various protests across the country, we had 4 stabbings, 1 shooting. A couple of weeks ago, we had a stabbing on Beacon Street in front of the State House during a protest, and another assault. So, you know, I was reading an article this morning, and the ABC report concluded that shootings have become somewhat commonplace at protests in recent months. So that's a problem, and that's, I think the issue with that is if we allow protests to get out of control without effective means of controlling them, then we will see increased violence, and that's unfortunately what we're seeing. And this isn't a critique of how other police departments are handling it, and they are in fact using some of these techniques to try to handle the crowds, but without those techniques, I think we'll see crowds get out of control faster and violence escalate. And really what the police department's goal is to keep everybody safe, not just police officers, but there are plenty of protesters that are just there to protest that want no part of the violence. And those are the people that I think come here with the best of intentions, exercising their First Amendment rights, that we owe protection to as well. And we do owe protection to even people doing the wrong thing to use the minimum amount of force required. And I think that's what we do. We very rarely resort to any kind of force, and we extremely rarely resort to use of the weapons discussed in this ordinance. So that's, you know, that's my concern essentially with this, is that we're taking a tool away that is not used that often, but when it is used, is needed, and sometimes it's needed to be employed quite quickly. We do make every effort. We do have protocols to de-escalate. That is always part of what we do, and has been for as long as I've been involved in this aspect of policing, and I think we do it well. I think my concern is still that this limits our ability to react to a very dynamic situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for folks joining or understanding, this again, we're discussing the ordinance on restricting the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles. This is, but I want to be clear, this is not an outright ban. They're coming. In it, it restricts the use except for certain exceptions and exemptions, and that would be in C, Part 2, basically where we would be able to, or where Boston Police Department would be able to do it. So I just want people to understand that this is a restriction, but also provides exceptions so that it is not a ban. Jeff, Attorney Fleur from the National Lawyers Guild, have you had any specific language opening remarks, kind of just into the weeds?
Yeah, the language changes that should be in the draft that you have are mostly to clarify and make more specific some of the language in there. So there are specifics, and I'm happy to go through them if that's what the council would like or the working group would like.
Okay. Thank you.
Should I go through these, or do you want me to wait?
Wait just a little bit, and I'll probably have you and the lead sponsors go through that as a conversation that they can help.
Sure. There's nothing substantive changed from the basic ordinance. It's just clarifying language.
Well, why don't we have Rasan speak, and then if it's okay with Ricardo and with Andrea, we'll have Jeff go through what clarifying language he suggests. Is that okay?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Very well then. So just letting everyone know who's in the room. Rasan, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and good morning to the rest of the council. Appreciation to the lead sponsors for this. I think these are reasonable restrictions on the use of chemical agents and kinetic impact weapons that have been proven to cause substantial harm. And, you know, to the extent that the department has concerns about not being able to use it, I think the last working session, there were several pleas to provide language that could codify the current practices, because we're looking into the future, thinking about how future administrations might use these weapons. And so I think the regulations that have been proposed, as everyone has said, are not bans, but reasonable restrictions on its use. And so looking forward to having a conversation about how we can land on language that protects all the residents of Boston and those who come into the city.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to Jeff, we've been joined by Councilor Ed Flynn. Ed, if you want to, Councilor Flynn, excuse me, if you'd like to brief opening remarks, we're just doing the working session.
No, no, Councilor Edwards, thank you. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the Boston Police for being here. I want to learn more about this, so I have no comment. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. Okay, Jeff, Attorney Thur, you were going to break down what the differences in the clarifying language was?
Sure. So starting at the top in Section A, purpose, there was just a word left out. So we're adding the word control. The purpose of this ordinance is to restrict the use of chemical crowd control agents. Just putting in that word. Okay. In Section B, definitions, paragraph 4, again, this is to clarify what we mean by kinetic impact projectiles, and it shall mean an item or instrument fired from a gun or launcher intended to disorient and or incapacitate, because that some of the weapons are meant to not incapacitate, but just to disorient. Again, small clarifying language. In Section C, paragraph 2, under exceptions and exemptions, this deals with some of the things that the police brought up and kind of codifying what the police say they already do, so that these weapons can't be used unless a deputy superintendent authorizes their use in response to specific ongoing acts of violence, and the deputy superintendent has determined that the violence or property destruction can't be controlled or quelled through other methods, and that there's no other reasonable methods of de-escalation that will be successful in preventing or controlling such acts. So that what you have there is the senior officer who's had a great deal of training and experience makes the determinations that the violence can't be controlled and that they've used the reasonable methods of de-escalation, which the police say they already use. So that basically is saying, codifying exactly what Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick has talked about. And then in the paragraph below that, again, it's just kind of clarifying that the on-scene supervisor witnesses the actions that are going on. And then the people against whom these weapons may be used are given a warning, and there is a way for people to exit the area after a warning is issued, and telling them what specific weapon would be used, and that it will be deployed shortly thereafter. And again, it's just clarifying language. There's nothing really new in that. There is I guess in that paragraph, a parentheses around C is missing one side of the parentheses, but that's all. In Section D, in the enforcement section, this is just to have the Boston Police Department implement the ordinance by making sure that all of the officers in Boston are aware of it by posting a copy of it in all police stations. Since this ordinance also goes to affects other police or law enforcement agencies operating within the city of Boston, the city has to receive a copy of this ordinance. And that this ordinance should be part of the training that officers receive before they join the Boston Police Force. There's a new paragraph 2 under enforcement. This is kind of a standard paragraph that any violation of this ordinance would be an injury and that a person could go into court and seek injunctive relief or declaratory relief. And that's just to ensure compliance with the ordinance, that people who see that it is being misused can seek relief from the courts and oversight to make sure, as with any other law, that this ordinance can be enforced by the courts. And in paragraph 4, of course, as this is a city ordinance, nothing in this ordinance should be construed to limit people's rights under state or federal law. And last but not really least at all is a new paragraph 6. There is, as everyone knows, I'm sure there's a police reform bill that is on the desk of the governor that's been passed by the legislature. And a lot of that requires a reporting of statistics, a federal and a state oversight agency being created. And paragraph 6 basically says that violations of this ordinance by any member of law enforcement will be reported in writing to the City of Boston government agencies, which have any oversight responsibilities for the Boston Police Department, and to any state agencies which have oversight responsibilities. If the governor signs that bill, there will be at least one state agency. And that these reports are to be made, at least published annually by the City of Boston and made freely available to the members of the public as a matter of public record. So as I said, these are mostly clarifying language changes, and I'm happy to answer any questions about any of them, but I don't think there's anything substantively new in this, in the proposed language being considered now.
So I had some quick questions, honestly, and I forgot to mention them in my introductory remarks for the lead sponsors. Councillor Arroyo or Campbell, I'm curious, what was the effective date of this ordinance? Was there any lead time for the police department? If this were to pass, for example, when does it become effective? And then also, I just want to put out there that the 2 minutes doesn't seem realistic to me in terms of a warning system. Did you hear from anybody else? Is this 2 minutes coming from other ordinances? The practicality, like in 2 minutes, so much can happen. That's between their warning and you have the opportunity to do something to remove yourself. It didn't settle well with me the first time I heard about the 2 minutes, and that's in the original language. So 2 things. When does this become effective? And the 2 minute warning, it seems, and there's 2 2-minute warnings. There's the first warning, 2 minutes to disperse, so on and so forth, clarified by Jeff, where you need to go. And then the second warning also is the same thing, plus what projected kinetic impact missile, or what, sorry, kinetic impact projectile they would use. So that's 4 minutes lead time. I think it's prompting officers to assume here comes a large crowd just to cover myself. I'm just going to start giving warnings. There may not be much going on, but if I have 4 minutes, I might as well just start putting these warnings out here now to disperse this crowd. I don't know how realistic 2 minutes is, or 4 minutes really. So that's to the lead sponsors.
So I'll take this in specific orders. In terms of the lead-in time, I haven't really.
I'm so sorry, Councilor Roy. I apologize. Councilor Baker also joined us. I apologize. Councilor Baker, did you want to note anything before we got into this exchange? Apologize to Councilor Royo.
No, thank you. I'm just here listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Councilor Royo.
No worries. In speaking with Councilor Campbell, I think there's space there for us to discuss what a reasonable amount of lead-in time is to that. We haven't really discussed a specific date and time for these to take effect. In terms of the 2 minutes, in terms of turning into 4 minutes, I've been to several protests and events where if you're in the middle of a crowd and you're asked to disperse, I think it's only fair that we give people the ability to disperse. And if you're looking at the specific amount of time that it would take for somebody to exit themselves from sort of the range or the radius of tear gas or rubber bullets, whatever it may be that's being used, that's a wide range of space. And if we're trying to give folks the ability to actually leave that area to disperse, which I think is the goal for crowd control in the first place, if you ever have to use it, I think the idea is to disperse a crowd. You want to give them the ability to leave. You want to give them the space to leave. I'm open to hearing what we think a appropriate amount of time is, but I do think that the 2 minutes was tailored so that people would actually have the ability to leave the range of these weapons because they have a large burst cloud. They have a large space and radius, and so it would be good for folks to actually have the ability to leave. As far as just kind of officers preemptively giving out warnings, I think this ordinance in itself makes it clear that they have to actually be seeing unlawful behavior specifically in order to do this. It's not just a matter of, there's a crowd here and we would prefer the crowd not be here anymore, so we're going to tear gas them or we're going to rubber bullet them. It's more so about there's an ongoing act of violence. There's something that's happening right this second that we know we want to do this, and so we're going to issue this warning. So I don't know if that's a all-inclusive answer for the three things, and I don't know if Councilor Campbell wants to add anything to that, but in terms of those three things, I can tell you that the time that was settled upon was to give folks the ability and time to leave an area. The ordinance itself kind of deals with when it's appropriate to give that time. We did not speak about lead-in time on this, so I think we're happy to have a conversation about how long it takes to really implement that and train that. I will say, though, that this is, according to superintendent, this is sort of what they already do, allegedly, right? This is the stuff that they already do, and so I think that the lead-in time would not need to be necessarily that long if this is what they're already being trained to do and what they're already doing. And so with that, I'll hand it over. I see Councilor Campbell has turned her camera on, so thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And the issue, before you go, the issue with the lead-in time also is because we're subjecting BPD to lawsuits, right? We're subjecting to some substantial liabilities, and so that's also why. That's why. Okay, Councilor Campbell.
No, that's totally understand that too, Madam Chair. And I think it came up in the initial hearing. It came up in the subsequent working session, of course, coming up now. And what we said from the beginning, along with the advocates too, and thank them for their proposed amendments, was that we wanted the department to offer us some suggestions there, and specifically around that piece, because they're the experts. We were trying to go with what we thought was reasonable based on conversations with folks who are on the panel, but we didn't get anything back. And so we were open. I think we remain open. I think I can't speak for obviously the Lawyers Guild or ACLU and what their position might be with respect to this. But I do remember, of course, specifically saying at the very beginning of the conversation in the first hearing that if BPD had thoughts and concerns around the timing piece, we were absolutely open to making some changes there. We were going with what we thought was reasonable under the circumstances.
Thank you. Jeff has raised his hand, and I still wanted to also go through all my colleagues as well. But I wanted to read the letter from Council President Janey into the record. Dear Chairwoman Edwards, I regretfully cannot attend today's working session on docket 0811 due to illness. I applaud and stand in support of the makers, Councilor Arroyo and Campbell, for their leadership on this critical issue. This ordinance meets the current moment as we are reforming and revisioning our existing systems to create meaningful and impactful change in our city for all of our residents. We must be codifying clear and transparent protocols on the use of chemical crowd control agents and other forms of projectiles to ensure that we are striking the right balance between protecting residents' First Amendment rights during lawful protests, while ensuring overall public safety. I look forward to reviewing today's recording and committee report. And finally, I'm eager to work with the committee on the recommended next steps. Please read this letter into the record. Sincerely, Councilor Janey, City Council President. Thank you. So I'm going to go to Jeff, and then we're going to go into in order of arrival with my colleague, Attorney Jeff. Sorry.
So in terms of the amount of time, the National Lawyers Guild and myself personally have been providing legal observers for demonstrations in Boston and in the whole of Eastern Massachusetts for about the last 30 years. And these kinds of demonstrations rarely get out of hand, as Superintendent McGoldrick has pointed out. There is sufficient time for the police to react because they do have other weapons at their command that they can use. They can still use pepper spray and so forth on individuals to arrest a particular individual who is committing a crime. And that this does not ban that. And there is sufficient time to stop individuals within a crowd who are committing some sort of act of violence or property destruction. So there's plenty of time for them to give these warnings and to have people have an opportunity to disperse so that these weapons are not used indiscriminately on the crowd. So I think based upon our 30 years of experience, that we've gathered from our legal observers, that this is sufficient to give the crowd these two warnings. It's sufficient time for the police to be able to react. Thank you.
If I could just address some issues that have come up. So, Attorney mentions that pepper spray on an individual would be allowed. It would not be. Under this ordinance, pepper spray on an individual present at a crowd of more than 10 people is banned unless it's approved by a deputy superintendent or higher who is observing specific acts. So that's just what the ordinance says. That's, unless I'm missing something, that seems to be a clear misstatement of this ordinance.
I think, if I may, what's being missed is whether or not a deputy is witnessing the direct act. If the deputy isn't witnessing the direct act and authorizing its action, then no, it wouldn't be allowed. But if somebody is, say, stabbing somebody in front of them and they're witnessing that act, then I would say that this actually does allow them to do that. I think
respectfully, I would say it does not allow that. Respectfully, it does not allow that without the warnings.
It does allow that without the warnings. I'm pretty sure on the exceptions, and Jeff, you can jump in here, but I'm fairly certain.
Like that section to me, and let me know where it says that there's an exception to the warnings. I don't see one.
To all my colleagues again who may have just joined, the working session draft was sent out to you in advance. It should be in your inbox. So if you wanted to follow along where the discourse is, specifically we're discussing when the 2-minute warning would apply and in the individual setting. So that's what we're discussing, just to give some context.
While everyone's kind of reviewing to see if my understanding of the language is consistent with theirs, I would just cite a couple of other things. Attorney Furer's description of this new language as somewhat innocuous housekeeping type language is not really accurate according to my perception of it. And in section 2A1, the additional language invites never-ending second guessing on what the police did, with language such as cannot be controlled or quelled through any other means, any conceivable means that someone could come up with, whether or not we actually had it available or not. Because what would happen is if we didn't have it available, then obviously the complaint would be that we should have had it available. And I know it does go on to say, has determined that no other reasonable means of de-escalation, but that's a separate sentence. So it's a separate section of that sentence. So, in de-escalation, since we're discussing it, really isn't covered that much in this ordinance, but where it is covered pretty extensively is in the new police reform bill that Attorney Fair mentioned. That actually has a pretty extensive de-escalation section to it, a very extensive reporting section anytime any of these devices are used. So there is an extraordinary amount of oversight on this, which kind of causes me to look at this as superfluous. If we are going to have police reform legislation passed at the state level, it doesn't seem advisable to me to have each municipality have their own theory of policing practices relative to crowd controls. So it changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, where we would have to provide officers assisting us with our law in the city. And if we go to help a neighboring city or town, they would have to provide us with their law. It really seems like the interoperability that we rely on and really would not be able to do it as safely without that interoperability would be at risk, in addition to the fact that we would probably have a hard time convincing people to join us in policing crowds at all if we had a much different standard than the state law. So I do think that the state police reform legislation, it gives a little more comprehensive treatment of crowd control and is probably what should be the standard. Given, and I know this wasn't in place or wasn't released when this ordinance was written, but I think that the state statute should probably control, assuming it's passed at some point.
Thank you. Thank you. I understand, Jeff, you've raised your hand, but my colleagues have also questions. And so I'd like for folks, and I do appreciate, Superintendent, your perspective. Thank you very much. It's really exciting to actually be talking about the language and how you think it's going to be impacting day-to-day practical implementation. So let's going in order of arrival so we can get questions from all my colleagues. So I didn't know if the lead sponsors had any specific questions or if we could go to the other colleagues to allow for them to ask their questions.
I'll just quickly say, I too, appreciate the lieutenants chiming in. I mean, obviously, this is our third working session, or third opportunity to discuss this. We had a lot of time, and I agree on the state legislation. There's some good things in there, but we have no idea where that's going to go, when it's going to be passed. No clue. And I don't think it prohibits us from taking the lead and moving quicker on some of these pressing reforms on our side. And so I don't have any other questions other than, if their stance is that they are not opposed to the ordinance, which I thought that was the stance of the administration and the department, that this is something they just wouldn't like to see done. If it isn't that, then of course are welcome, as we said from the very beginning, to any suggested changes to the language that we could incorporate to make sure it's balanced, it's fair, and approach, and of course includes the police department and lieutenant in the lieutenant's suggestions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go down the line then, unless I hear from Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Liz Braden.
I think the issue of consistency across the board between different police departments is a pretty important one, actually. So hopefully the state level legislation will proceed and will meet some of these concerns. But the notion, we've seen that when there's a protest, that large numbers of police officers come in from other districts to support the BPD. And if they have inconsistent rules across the different police districts, then, or the different police departments, then I think that's going to be problematic. So I think having a unified standard across the state would probably be what ultimately we would love to see. But I think it does raise some logistical questions. And apart from that, that's the only question I have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Mejia.
So sorry, I'm on mute. So I just have a few questions. I'm just curious, in the working session draft, it states that we need to make sure that all have been notified. How are we interpreting all? Does this include people who do not speak English? And I'm also curious, while we're talking about being able to communicate with folks, lately my daughter has been talking to me a lot about the American Sign Language. And I'm just curious about communication. Like, how are we thinking about the communication of this rollout and ensuring that people fully understand what is happening around them and what the communication is? I just would like to know a little bit more about that.
Excellent questions. This is a practical implementation question. I think the makers first should maybe consider how they envisioned multilingual warnings or warnings to folks who are deaf or hard of hearing in that particular moment. And then I didn't know, and then I think I can turn it over to practical implementation questions to the Boston Police Department, again, about the warning system today. That would be good to know how you do this now. And then to any other, to the advocates, what their thoughts were. Excellent perspective. Thank you, Councillor Mejia. To the makers, then to BPD, and then to the advocates.
I'll just say, since my video's on, we hadn't put specifics. First of all, thank you, Councilor Mejia, for the question and the additions here, which are excellent and great. If anything, we were looking to codify what the police department said they already do. So I do think the question you raised, Chair, around what when they give notifications to large crowds, what that currently looks like would be helpful here. Happy to make suggested changes to sort of get at that. But if the police department already has that in their procedures or practice or policy already, we could reference that or get creative as to how we do that. But I think it's an excellent point.
Thank you, Superintendent McGoldrick.
Well, I think this raises an important issue of liability for the city, and in addition to the fairness of giving everyone the same amount of warning. It's really not within the department's capability to understand exactly who is in these crowds and exactly what additional warnings would be helpful and would be necessary. But we would be liable for anyone that can make a claim that they weren't given adequate warning. So, I mean, certainly we could pre-record some dispersal orders. However, we'd have to understand where we'd be telling them to disperse from, because we're required to give them a safe means of egress. So that's a complicating factor. As far as the sign language, I don't know how we would broadcast that out to the extent that we could broadcast audible messages. Obviously, that's a challenge. I don't know how we would work that issue, but certainly, that everyone would be entitled to the same amount of warning, and we'd be liable. And I say we talk about the police department getting sued, but it's the money that's going to come from the city when we lose. So there's all sorts of liability. And on the warnings themselves, as Councilor Arroyo stated, that under this ordinance, there has to be specific acts of violence or property damage for us to initiate the warnings. However, under state law for dispersing crowds, you can give warnings for a much lower standard without violence, without property damage, just a crowd that is unruly and declared an unlawful assembly for, much lower standards of conduct. So this is really somewhat in conflict with Chapter 269(1) of Mass General Laws, as far as what the standards for a dispersal order would be. So what risk I see that presenting is that we give a dispersal order not with the intent of using any of these crowd control devices, and then we give another order at some point later on with the with the intent of using these devices in compliance with this ordinance. It gets to be not just a logistical challenge of languages and people who need certain accommodations to convey the information, but also which warning are we giving? What version of it is going to apply? How do we document and how do we ensure that the people in the crowd understand this is a dispersal order? We don't necessarily intend to use any particular force, but you are subject to arrest, versus this is a dispersal order, you're still subject to arrest. Oh, and by the way, we're going to use these devices that we're required to give this separate order and announcement for. So it's, again, it comes down to sort of the deconfliction between state and municipal ordinances. And I think if the state is coming up with a solution, then we ought to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Mejia, I'm sorry, we were going to go to the advocates.
Councilor Flaherty has a question at the right time, Madam Chair.
You're next, Councillor Flaherty, after the advocates speak.
So a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is the state police already have, as part of their guidelines and policies, that they are required to obey and act under the ordinances of the local jurisdiction in which they are operating. That's already part of the state police guidelines. That's certainly true in any other mutual aid. When the police come in from Weymouth or Braintree or Cambridge or Somerville into the city of Boston, they are under the command and control of the Boston police. So there really is no conflict there because they're required to obey the laws of the city of Boston and enforce them. And the Boston police are the ones who are supervising those other officers. With regard to conflict with the state law, there is no conflict there with Chapter 269, Section 1. That only says that the state police or the local police can tell people to immediately and peaceably disperse if the crowd is acting unlawfully, riotously, or tumultuously. There's nothing in this ordinance that says they still can't give that order to disperse. This ordinance only deals with using weapons, dangerous weapons, against this crowd of people. But if the police see people acting unlawfully or riotously or tumultuously, they still can, under the state law, give an order to disperse. There's no conflict there. It's just what weapons they are permitted to use there. As to whether the other thing I think to keep in mind is that many of the state laws and many of our local laws always leave some room for interpretation. And the courts do not just impose unreasonable restrictions or interpretations on those laws. The job of the court is to look at all of the circumstances and all of the evidence and see within the spirit and intent and meaning of a particular ordinance whether the police have acted reasonably and within the confines of that law. They're not going to, the courts are not going to impose every single restriction on them that is not mentioned in the ordinance. And that will always be true, and that's always been true of any law that has been passed in Massachusetts. As for the use of pepper spray, again, the whole point of this ordinance is to prevent the use of these weapons on a crowd of people, gatherings involving more than 10 persons. So it is not restricting the use on an individual who is committing a crime in front of an officer, a supervisor who sees it, or any other officer who sees it. If the weapon is going to be used only on that particular individual, The whole point of the ordinance is to prevent it from being used on a large crowd of people. That's clearly the intent, that's clearly the language of this, of the ordinance, and so I don't think there's any restriction for that. And last but not least, I want to again remind the council that similar restrictions are already in place for use of these kinds of weapons against prisoners within the Department of Correction in the state. And they have been in place for quite some time, and they're very similar to these restrictions, and they take into account the effect that these weapons have on crowds of people and the effect they can have on individuals within those crowds. There's no reason, if the Department of Correction dealing with a population of incarcerated people can operate safely within those restrictions, there's no reason why the Boston Police cannot operate safely and effectively within these restrictions when there are citizens out on the streets exercising their First Amendment rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Just moving on with the questions. Councillor Flaherty?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to address the question as to how long and whether 2 minutes is long enough. I have to assume that every situation is different and would arguably have to sort of defer to those that have the training and experience around such. And I would also assume that in those situations, there would be some type of command post or someone that's sort of high level with training and experience would be making the decision. And very much like a house fire, there's certain fires that need sort of immediate attention. There's others that you can do a search and rescue. There's others that you can allow it to smolder, etc. So I would really defer to those that have experience in the field as to whether it's 2 minutes, whether it's 3 minutes, or it's 4 minutes. I will say that obviously whatever Portland and whatever Seattle and whatever Minneapolis are doing, we should be doing the opposite. Those cities are an absolute disaster right now, and we should be learning from what other cities across the country are doing or not doing to make sure that we're doing the best we can and enhancing our community policing model, and we're keeping folks safe and we're keeping the peace. And I'd also like to compliment Superintendent Ken McGoldrick. Obviously, he's an attorney and he's given a lot of thought to this. This is obviously a healthy debate and back and forth. He's looking obviously at the public safety angle, the public health angle, the constitutional law angle, the general liability angle. So in each one of the clauses and sentences that has meaning, he's obviously given a lot of thought to it. So I have a lot of appreciation and respect for him coming to the table today, prepared to have a discussion and a dialogue in the working session. And obviously we'll continue to try to work to make reasonable efforts to put something on the books that again makes sense for Boston. We're unique here in terms of how well positioned we are as a city, and how our community policing model is the envy of jurisdictions across the country, and it's largely driven because of leadership of people like Kevin and others that separate us. And it's also why we haven't had a lot of the situations that we're seeing unfold and continue to unfold across the city. So I don't know what that sort of reasonable amount of time is, but obviously when we have a command situation and we have someone that's of authority that can make the call as to whether or not it needs to be enhanced or whether or not it needs to be delayed, I'd love to hear from sort of, a tactical position or standpoint as to what factors or what decisions go into whether or not the warning is initiated and or the tactical weapons are deployed, and what rises to the level of, when it's almost getting to the point where it's too late. And I'd obviously really would rather err on the side of caution, the expression. I'd rather be looking at it than looking for it in some instances in an effort to keep the peace and to keep people and property safe in Boston. Obviously, it's a tough call, but we obviously want to make sure that we're acting within reason, that we're not acting too soon. At the same time, it would be disastrous if we acted too late. So striking that balance in on a case-by-case basis is probably most appropriate, but it would have to be led and driven by someone in leadership, but someone has the appropriate level of training and experience.
So again, as we did before, and responding to the questions, I guess we can give it. Well, those were more practical implementation questions. So if it's okay, we'll just start with the superintendent, and then we'll go to the advocates.
So, to answer a couple of questions from Councilor Flaherty, that's exactly what we do. We have a command post. No one's using crowd control techniques without approval from the incident commander or a subordinate. The operations section chief is one of the terms of the people that will be able to implement that. Right now, without this ordinance in place, we can, as Attorney Freer described, if we see some illegal activity that can be addressed by an officer using the pepper spray on his person, for his own personal pepper spray on his belt, he can use that to address the situation. My interpretation of this ordinance, though, it says right here, a chemical control agent against any person or persons engaged in a protest, demonstration, or other gathering. That tells me where it singles out person or persons, you cannot use it on one person if he's part of the crowd. I mean, if someone completely unrelated to the crowd, is robbing a nearby gas station, of course, yeah, you can use pepper spray if he's running with some weapon that is appropriate to use pepper spray for. But if he's a member of the crowd and it's an individual doing something unlawful, you cannot address him with a personally issued pepper spray under this ordinance. It seems clear to me. Chemical control agent against any person or persons in a crowd or demonstration of more than 10. I think those two things are important. Like, it's the timing issue, the fact that there's no individual initiative to address crowd control concerns as they emerge, which currently exists now, and we don't have officers out there roaming around in onesies and twosies. If we have a serious crowd control issue, there's sergeants, there's lieutenants, there's captains, there's people with a lot of experience that are able to implement independent judgment. This ordinance takes that away and sets up a time frame for essentially approval to use. Very effective and almost universally safe, especially when it comes to pepper spray. It's a very safe device that can have a dramatic impact on a crowd and prevent violence. So I do see this as extremely restrictive. I know people try to downplay the ordinance by saying it's a restriction, not a ban, but it's essentially a ban with a limited exception. So I mean, it all depends on how you want to look at it. But that it would take away the individual assessment of what's going on and remove it to essentially people with less experience and no proximity to the events, which is problematic. Right now we have methodologies that have worked, that have, I think if you look at how Boston handled some of these situations versus other cities, and we did have one night with a significant damage and looting and violence, and we have a number of officers who are still out injured from that, and that's with these devices available. If we didn't have these devices available, then I suspect we would have seen a lot more property damage, a lot more looting, and certainly a lot more police officers injured, but also a lot of people who were just there as part of the protest. A lot of people who were just there to see what was going on would have been victimized by a crowd that was, doing everything, including firing about a dozen rounds from a handgun at a group of police officers towards the end of the night. So, again, my concern is timely, effective use of devices that have been used judiciously and not misused in recent memory. And, the first time we've used the sponge round weapons in my time here. The first time we've used CS gas in my time here. The other protests, we've used short bursts of pepper spray from the personally carried pepper spray that the officers have. And that's been the extent of it. So I see this as a pretty severe restriction that could have serious implications without really, I'm not seeing the impetus for this, especially when there's a state law that's going to provide some oversight to this issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize, Rasan. I didn't follow up with you the last time. If it's okay, we'll start with Rasan and then go to Jeff.
Okay, thank you. A couple things. In regards to the concerns about the restrictive nature of this. I think the whole point of this is to be a working group. Let's work through the language. Let's find the reasonable alternatives and put language forward so that the council has something to work with instead of just saying it's a restriction, it's a ban. Well, let's make it workable. And I think those were the pleas from the counselors last time, and we're here having the same conversation. In regards to the pending state legislation, it is not enacted into law. It is on back in, the governor has sent it back with amendments, but specifically in regards to tear gas or any other chemical weapon, what is being contemplated is that law enforcement shall not discharge or order the discharge of those things to impact a person's behavior unless, one, de-escalation tactics have been attempted and failed and are not feasible based on the totality of the circumstances, and two, the measure used are necessary to prevent imminent harm and the foreseeable harm inflicted by the tear gas or chemical weapons. And so that's what's on the table. That doesn't go as far as what's being proposed. It doesn't call for the warnings. It does have the reporting requirement, but like, to the extent that that has been invoked, we need to know what it actually says. Concerns about relying on this at this point is the governor's amendments have sought to change what the definitions of imminent harm means, and he's sought to change the definition of what totality of the circumstances mean. But as far as being concerned about other departments, what the state law could potentially be is a good basis, but I don't see that as a reason not to have a higher standard in the most populous city in the Commonwealth, where which seems to be the epicenter of many of these protests. And then if folks are coming in because of those circumstances, they will know that there is a higher standard in Boston. Departments are in contact and communication all the time. And for something as essential as this, when they are invited in, this is something that that can be noticed to them and made to operate. But again, let's work with the language to make it work.
Thank you very much, Rasan. Just 1 second, I want to make sure. Jeff. And then Ricardo, one of the lead sponsors, had raised his hand as well. So, and then we'll go on to Councilor Wu, then Asabi George, then Flynn, then Baker.
Follow up a little bit on what Rasan has said. The state legislation has not been passed. It does not specifically address all of the kinetic impact weapons that this local ordinance does. And as we know, there was a woman killed, Victoria Snellgrove, killed by one of these weapons back in 2004. The ordinance does, it's intentional in preventing individual police officers from making an assessment of using these weapons and giving that authority, as Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick pointed out, to people who have more training, more experience, so that it's not just up to an individual officer or a lower level officer of deciding when to use these. The evidence is overwhelming that these weapons can cause very serious harm to innocent people, to bystanders, to passersby, to people exercising their First Amendment rights. And what we are trying to do here is strike a balance between protecting people's rights under the Constitution to assemble, to have free speech, to petition the government for redress of grievances, and the ability of the police department to control and prevent serious crimes. And I think this ordinance does strike that balance. I disagree with Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick's interpretation of the statute. I think the courts would look at this as a statute that is preventing the use of these weapons against crowds of people. That's the entire intent of it. That's what the language talks about. If in the middle of a crowd, someone is engaged in a stabbing or is engaged in looting, that is not part of the demonstration or a protest. That is not exercising any sort of First Amendment rights. And the police always have the opportunity to go in and arrest people who are engaging in a crime immediately in front of them. And there's nothing in this ordinance that would prevent that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Arroyo, and then Councillor, to answer whatever question, Councillor Arroyo, and then to Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would just say that the hearing on this was in August, and here we are in December, and I don't believe that BPD has offered any language or amendments to this as of yet. And so, you know, I do get sort of the frustration that I have heard from some of the advocates as to, you know, we did implore them in the last working session to bring forward some language, and here we are and we still don't have it. And I think just to address one of the major concerns I think I've now heard from Councillor Flaherty, Councillor, Madam Chair, is the 2 minutes. And one of the things that I was struck with in doing this research, and I'm going to punt it to Jeff, who I think has more of a knowledge base on this, but my understanding is in the state of Massachusetts, when there is a prison riot, in order to use these tools, the tear gas or kinetic impact projectiles, they actually have to go through every person who is in that block, in that wing's medical records prior to authorizing that. And is that correct, Jeff? You're muted.
Yep. Basically, that's correct. That they are supposed to look at not only the person they're going to use the weapons on, but they're supposed to look at the medical records and have knowledge of the medical records of the people who these weapons can affect in the immediate cell block, in the immediate adjacent cells. And the weapons are not supposed to be used unless directed by the head of the correctional facility, the warden and so forth, and not by individual officers, not by the immediate supervisor, but by the director of the prison facility.
Thank you very much. And the point I'm making here is that process, I don't believe would take 4 minutes. I think that process would likely take longer. And if we're talking about residents in our community getting these kinds of protections, I don't think it's wildly inaccurate to give them 4 minutes to exit an area. And, you know, I will just say Boston does have a history of this going in the worst possible case scenario. We did lose a life to a kinetic impact projectile with a bullet to the face because, again, these are not a rubber bullet specifically. These are not, you know, controllable weapons in the sense that they're focused on one individual. They are crowd control and they affect crowds. And so, you know, to the time requirement, I would say that the fact that we as a state, Massachusetts, and we see the issues right now with just the bill in front of us, have already codified language that allows for within our correctional facilities to take the time to seek every person's medical records and to cross-reference those medical records and to make sure that we're doing that. I do think that the 2 minutes followed by another 2 minutes is an acceptable amount of time. But I'm happy to hear any kind of feedback on why that somehow would not be an acceptable amount of time. But I think that I think in terms of what the precedent is for what we do in our state prisons, in our city prisons, in our jails, I think that makes sense. And so for that one point, I wanted to just touch on, you know, when that was calculated, part of the calculation, at least for me as a lead sponsor, was the fact that that process within our prison system can't possibly take shorter than 4 minutes to run through everybody's medical records and make these decisions. And yet somehow they've been able to operate with these restrictions. They've been able to do this and I don't see why our BPD wouldn't be able to do the same on the streets of Boston.
Well, I would say that, that if I may, did you have something else you wanted to go to first?
So you're specifically just addressing Councilor Arroyo right now?
Yes.
Or is there other, okay. And then I'm gonna, again, to all the advocates and BPD, I'm gonna get through the list of the other counselors. Go ahead, Superintendent.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, it's the fact that we won't have an opportunity to timely address an emerging problem, and now we're playing catch up. So it's not whether is 3 minutes the right number, is 5 minutes the right number. That's not the issue. The issue is once things get out of control, and we cannot stop that. I mean, I respect Attorney Freer's experience and his version, his interpretation of what the statute says. My interpretation and the way that if this ordinance is passed, the way that I would explain it to the officers under my command is that it applies to an individual person. It doesn't matter if someone pulls out a knife or a club or whatever. If he's in a crowd, if he's a member of a crowd, according to this ordinance, I would instruct them not to use the weapons covered by this ordinance, because I think that's the correct interpretation. I think that's a standard that we would be held to. And to see this argument of medical conditions. So if someone who has a medical condition in a crowd who is impacted is now going to sue and say that they should have had some particular protection, because this is the second time this issue has been brought up, juxtaposing the law that's used for prisoners versus what we'd be expected to know on the street. I fully expect in a lawsuit, which would certainly come if this ordinance is enacted and we happen to use these weapons, someone's going to say they didn't get the proper notification. Someone's going to say they didn't understand it. Someone's going to have a medical condition. And now we're going to be defending ourselves in court against a standard that would be impossible for us to meet. We'd have no way of understanding what the medical conditions of each and every person are, but we'd be held to that standard because I'm sure someone on the plaintiff's side would say, well, the police officer should have known that there are people who could have compromised breathing issues or what have you. I just think this sets up the city to be held to an impossible standard, whatever the time frame may be, whatever the interpretation people may say they have of this ordinance. I think there'd be probably a different interpretation by a different plaintiff's attorney when they're suing the city. I think they would say we shouldn't have used the individual officer's pepper spray on that one person because he's a member of the crowd. And I just don't see any way around that in my reading of the ordinance.
Madam Chair, just a brief thing. Just to clarify that this ordinance doesn't actually make any requirements for BPD to know or assess or make any determinations on anybody's medical records whatsoever. That's just not in the ordinance. The only reason that I brought that up is that the amount of time that it would take for a prison to do that, I think we could argue would be less than the 4 minutes that we're asking here for warnings for people to disperse. That's it. There's nothing in this ordinance that has anything to do with medical records whatsoever.
Thank you. Councilor Wu, followed by Councilor Sabi George and Councilor Flynn. She may have stepped off. Councilor Sabi George may have stepped off. She did say she'd be in and out. Councilor Flynn, then Councilor Baker. Councilor Flynn? Councilor Baker.
I'm on, Councilor.
Oh, I apologize. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Apologize for that. So my question relates to, I understand the debate that's going on. I just want to ask the Deputy Superintendent, what I'm concerned about is, the time frame of lethal force that might be imminent and doing nothing in a dangerous situation because we might not have the adequate time to do the notification. So it might put, I don't know if it's going to put the protesters in harm's way, and it also may put the Boston police in harm's way. especially during an unruly crowd. What I have seen is the majority of protesters are peaceful. However, during these difficult times when it just takes one person to cause violence, that's the question I have, is what is the time frame from doing nothing and necessary force? I just want to ask the deputy superintendent about that question, and I also know that the deputy superintendent has studied this issue as a Boston police officer. I also know he's an attorney and he's had education and training in the U.S. military, very professional education, academic environment. So I just want to ask the deputy superintendent if he shares those same concerns that I do.
Thank you, Counselor. Yes, I mean, those are exactly my concerns. I mean, the reality is that especially in a crowd environment, and more particularly when there are two crowds that oppose each other. I mean, when there's a crowd that's attacking the police, I mean, we can find a way to protect ourselves and give warnings, as we always do, and then react. But when there's a crowd that's attacking another crowd, as we just saw this weekend, resulting in stabbings and shootings, that is where it becomes problematic. Now, I assure you, we would not sit back and do nothing. We would react and we would protect people in the crowd. However, we would have to do it differently, and that's the problem. We'd be taking away some very effective tools that can very quickly change negative actions, violent actions of a crowd, and give the police a little bit of initiative that we can isolate people who are intent on violence, separate crowds intent on ramping up rhetoric and violence, and when you see things edging out of control, these tools are very effective. And I'm not talking about the impact rounds in particular, because we very rarely use them, but even short bursts of pepper spray that in an outdoor environment have not, to my knowledge, been shown to affect anyone in a long-term negative way. I've been doused with pepper spray myself accidentally at these events, and I've managed to continue on with my day without any problems. I've unfortunate firsthand experience. Is it uncomfortable? It certainly is, but you'd be amazed at how effectively that can stop the actions of a crowd. Now, if there's ongoing violence that we seek to stop, and we have to give between the warnings and the 2-minute delays, roughly 5 minutes, we would do other things. But you're correct; it would expose officers to danger. We'd have to go in there with our hands and batons, essentially, when people are in close proximity with unknown weapons in a crowd. And I'd point out, we've only had one horrible experience, but we had some other minor ones where the crowd was armed with a vast array of improvised weapons, some that took significant planning. If you have hundreds of frozen water bottles, you're coming to an event with the intent of harming other people. That's not something that you decided to do last minute when you happen to have hundreds of frozen water bottles, commercial grade fireworks that are used to attack police officers. But my concern is that they'd also be used to attack others in the crowd, and we'd have to use less efficient, less effective means to address that, which we would do, but it would cause us a significant delay in trying to turn the tide of violence, which would be potentially catastrophic, but certainly unfortunate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Superintendent. And if I have the opportunity to ask one final question, Councilor Edwards,
Go ahead.
maybe to the deputy. Okay, to the Deputy Superintendent again. Deputy, as we go forward, are these subjects, are these issues that will be taught at the police academy, and will we change the police academy around whether this is passed or not, but just knowing how to respond more effectively, safely during these difficult times?
Yes, Council. I mean, we're always teaching new recruits at the academy, officers and in-service, that the most current ways, that the best way to handle crowds. But I would just to be clear about how these are used, each officer has a small can of pepper spray. All of these other devices are used by people who have much more extensive training, and the impact rounds and the wider dispersal methods for pepper spray and CS gas. That's used by specifically trained officers with significant amount of experience, and importantly, under direct control of sergeants and lieutenants and captains. So your average officer, yes, they will be trained, and we're going to obviously focus more and more on de-escalation as we review our training procedures and as we incorporate what I expect will be the state police reform bill. But as far as these particular devices go, they're very highly trained, and it's not your average officer that even has experience or occasion to use or handle any of these.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent, and thank you to Councilor Edwards. No further questions.
Thank you very much. Just allowing me to get to the list, I do see that Councilor Mejia did raise her hand. I want to acknowledge that, but I wanted to go ahead and finish with Councilor Baker with any questions he had before I go back into the second round, or we go into kind of a back and forth. Councilor Baker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to make one point. I think we're comparing a prison setting with something that happens on the outside, something that happens on the street, thousands of people. In a prison setting, there is somewhat of controlled environment, whether it's inside or even in a yard. You know what you're dealing with. You know the people are there. I'm not really following that argument there as to how those two comparables. That's just a statement. I'd like to ask, what is the difference between tear gas and regular pepper spray? Is there a big difference there, Deputy?
There is a difference. So pepper spray is basically a plant-based compound, and it's an irritant, and it's the type of stuff that officers carry on the belt, and no one really carries mace, which is a different thing. This pepper spray is kind of the standard. Essentially, it washes off, and I've not experienced anyone, and I've been with hundreds of people and at different training events who have been exposed to it. I don't know anyone that's had a negative reaction. I'm sure you can find someone somewhere that had a negative reaction to it, but it's from what I've seen, universally well tolerated. CS is different. It's a chemical compound. It can be a little bit more of an irritant, and I've seen some people assert that that's more dangerous. But the notable issue with us is we use it in a crowd control situation, and it's going to be used outdoors, with very few exceptions, like a SWAT situation that might call for it. But for the most part, it's used outdoors and dissipates very quickly. So the notion that it's a crowd that affects everyone, that's not false. However, the further away from it you are, like anything that's dispersing, the less potent it is. So basically, the CS, the tear gas, is that's a generic kind of term, is a chemical, and it is fairly potent. And the pepper spray is essentially the spray that can be taken off an officer's belt and sprayed, and maybe effective for a couple of people for 15 or 20 feet. And there are various methods for dispersing the pepper spray as well that can be dispersed in a canister as well. It's just, but two different compounds. OC is less. We have less restrictions on OC. You'd need the incident commander's authorization to disperse the tear gas, the CS chemical.
And about how often in the last, say, 2 years, in a regular year, how often are we using tear gas or the kinetic impact weapons? The
first time that since I've been involved in this power policing, the first time was on May 31st. I know that there was a device used in 2004 in the tragic Victoria Snellgrove incident. That was a completely different weapon system that we haven't used since, and wouldn't use that system again, and wouldn't use any system in that way again. We did extensive testing on this sponge round, which is much different. It is an aimed, very accurate device that spreads out, and it's a softer foam rubber. I don't mean to diminish the fact that it does hurt. If you get hit with it, it's going to hurt. But it's considered a lot safer than most other options, and it is. So we've used that once, and the only time I recall using CS in a crowd control environment is on May 31st going into June 1st. I don't recall us ever using that in the past. So if, the previous time probably would have been, in my estimation, decades ago.
Thank you. Another something I want to throw out there, maybe Madam Chair, you can answer this. I know we bounced it around a little bit. How does we pass this as an ordinance? State guidance comes down, state law comes down, so that just supersedes this altogether? Is my thinking right there?
Thank you very much for the question. My understanding is that state law sets the real floor. And so in as much as state law, comes down on any topic that we're dealing with at the city level, provided that we are meeting their standards, and if we are above them, we should be fine. The issue is if we are below them or don't have a standard because as I've learned from other officers, I've learned from people around our cities, for example, the way we treat guns, the way we treat other aspects and training even is above other cities and towns in the city of Boston. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm still finishing in the state of Massachusetts. And so we actually rise above in many cases, Councilor Baker, but we cannot go below the floor. That's usually what the state, federal, so on and so forth sets. So we will see what the floors are. If this doesn't meet the state standards, then the state would supersede, excuse me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just want to echo some of the things that Councilor Flaherty had to say about, and I'm sure people on this call are sick of hearing this about the Boston police, that they're well trained. A lot of them are very much part of our communities. I don't think that they want to cause harm and cause damage. Not that doesn't take out the bad police officers that are in there, but I don't think we should be in a rush to follow Minneapolis, to follow Portland, to follow Seattle, places like that. And I say that not just about this issue, in a lot of issues. In Boston, we're the leader. There's a reason why we are still doing okay now. I mean, we're going to see a lot of these cities next year when this economy hits. They're not going to be doing as well as the way we are. I think we should lead, and that's about it. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councilor Baker. So I have one question, a hand raised, and about, within my kind of internal working timeline, it's about 20 more minutes in the hearing, though we can go over that. That's not, but I do want to make sure that people understand where we are and the issues that we discussed, so that we don't have too much repetition. I'm going to kind of break down what I heard as the cloud of things out there pending, and then I will turn it over. Oh, I see the hand has been lowered. And we can go back through the round, starting with the counselors. A couple things. One, there is still no implementation timeline, and I've not heard what timeline would make sense. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. I see you. I'm just going to go summarize the big issues out there still. Okay. I do not see if there's some form of restriction were to pass, it would be helpful to hear from the Boston Police Department. Do you need 3 months, 4 months, 6 months for this to be fully fleshed out? I highly would recommend the makers to put one in there. I do firmly believe it shouldn't just be an overnight thing, but that's my suggestion. I do think that the 2 minutes, the warning system it's still a concern to me. And so I've heard both sides, and I still think it's a concern to some other people. If to make some of your colleagues more comfortable, you were to reduce that time or to support the time, I think that would be helpful. I'll say outright, I do think the prison analogy is helpful to a very limited point, but it is a confined area. The pushback of the tear gas on the officers themselves for safety issues. There's a lot of different things. And there's also certain commitments that because we have chosen to imprison people, we have certain commitments to their health and safety in the confines of the buildings that we pay for, that we have in terms of not cruel and unusual punishment, things like that. So I just want to, the context is different for me. It is helpful to a certain extent, but it is not definitive for me. I think the all is very important. The all part that Councilor Mejia brought up, how this warning system would be implemented. And mind you, Councilor Mejia has pending, and we will likely pass some version, of language access ordinance that was looking at literally providing at least written documents in more than 4 or 5 languages. So there is a question about the implementation of this as it stands. Are you going to do this in English and Spanish and a third language, depending on where you are in the city? Maybe Chinese if you're downtown. How do people who are hard of hearing and deaf get access to this warning system? If it is about their safety and knowledge, that is very important for that's out there. There's also of course, the state and the city dynamics with those conversations. I hope I had helped and provided guidelines on that, but I think it's important. Councilor Flaherty brought up the mounted unit. I don't know that that's really something we could be implementing anyway in this one. It would probably have to be something we deal with in the budget cycle coming up. There's also the intercity coordination and how that works right now. And I think, I can't remember if it was Attorney Fleur or if it was Rasan who brought up the fact that we already have intercity differences. And when you go into different jurisdictions, that's odd. That happens right now. But that did come up. I wanted about at least 2 minutes. This is some answers. Janie and minute warning. Sorry, just looking at each one of the counselors, remembering their comments. Oh yes, and then there's the interpretation of this ordinance. And I think I want to make very clear, my understanding of the language and my understanding of both sides is that there's a confusion about, I would just use myself, I'll use my name. I have started a protest for whatever. I'm in a protest, I should say, for, I don't know, lack of Christmas lights. So I'm in the protest for lack of Christmas lights. I'm upset about it. And it's a peaceful protest. People are marching down Tremont Street. I picked that because that's just where it's likely to happen. If I decide to go off and start tearing down Christmas lights or tearing down whatever, at that point, I understand this ordinance to me, I'm no longer part of the protest. And therefore, me as an individual acting in any form of criminal way, I don't need a warning system. I don't need anything. An officer seeing me act foolish and in a criminal way can do what his training or her training allows for them to do, which could include those without a warning, because we're not talking about a protest anymore. We're simply talking about Edwards has gone off and is doing her thing. What I heard from from Officer Superintendent McGoldrick is that, in his interpretation of, sure, plaintiff's attorneys and liability is that any good plaintiff's attorney might very well say, no, Counselor Edwards was off, and she is part of that protest. And she was doing that act as part of her protesting, and therefore subject the city of Boston to liability, as any person bringing a lawsuit advocating for their client might try to stretch the law to do that, to protect them, or a defense attorney saying no, they weren't doing this criminal act, or so on and so forth. So I wanted to make sure I understand that where that debate is, but on its face, it has no intention. And I think if that's what they need is more definitive language to make very clear that someone who is not part of the protest, this does not apply to them. I think that makers should also consider that kind of language as well. So I hope I summarized the big buckets out there for further discussion. Councilor Mejia, you raised your hand, and then I'm going to go back through. If councilors could raise their hand, it would be more helpful than if I'm just kind of like, randomly doing that. I will start with the co-sponsors after Mejia, but then the other councilors, please raise your hand. Councilor Mejia. Councilor Mejia? Yeah.
Yes, I have really bad internet. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to quickly just go through back to the sign language situation. I just think that even if we can just commit to putting signs, large signs, or something of the sorts, I don't think that this is something that I think we have an opportunity to kind of put something in writing that will do our due diligence, even if it's just signage when there's a protest, just so that we can make sure that we're doing our due diligence. And then I remember in one of our previous sessions, we talked about the department actually meets to sit and to determine how many police officers are going to be sent out to protest. And it's a bit confusing to hear that we don't have any systems for knowing how many people who are going to be in the crowd. So I'm just a little bit unclear about the why we can't plan for certain things, which is what I understood that we did. So it's just more of a rant, less of a question, but I'm just curious about the process. But if anything, I want to just say just to really push on the idea of just creating some signage whenever there's a protest to include for folks who can't either read or write or just have a hard time with hearing. So that's what I would advocate for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. As hands are being raised, I'll just call. So Jeff, before I get to you, I want to make sure to go back to the lead sponsors, and then I will have Jeff respond to what Councilor, any questions or concerns. And to the other councilors, again, if you would raise your hands so I know to call and engage this conversation. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would say that sounds, to me, at least as a participant in this hearing, like a good summary of what's been said, a very accurate summary. I would say a couple things. On the lead-in, as to whether or not it takes effect literally upon passage or within 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, that was something that we were hoping BPD would be helpful in letting us know just how long it would take for them to implement this in a responsible, safe manner with their own team, with their own people. I don't think we've heard a time frame for that from them, but that's something we would certainly be open to hearing from them to implement. And so I appreciate that. I believe there was another question in there about languages and the warning. And what I would say is that this is based upon the belief that this is something that BPD already does and already has experience doing in terms of providing warnings to people who speak multiple languages or may be, for instance, blind or deaf or hard of hearing. And so the hope was that there are some systems or something already present in BPD that allows them to engage in warnings for people who don't speak English that could be used here simultaneously. In terms of the way that it's done already, according to their process. I don't know how you would, for instance, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, I'm blanking. In terms of lowering the temperature, in terms of
de-escalation.
De-escalation. Thank you so much. I don't know why I blanked on de-escalation. But in terms of de-escalation, I think it would be hard to de-escalate people who speak different languages if you're speaking to them in a different language. And so I'm sure BPD has some method or some policy or some way of doing this, or at least I would hope so. And so the hope was that there would be some collaboration there with what they're already doing and how they're already doing it to make that best work. And so on those two, I think there's something to be done there. I would again state that this has been since August that we've been having this out here, willing to have BPD sort of climb in and say, this is how much time, this is what we think here, this is what we think there. And now that we're in December, I think frankly, when we're talking about these crowds, when we're talking about just what it takes to extricate yourself from a crowd, when we're talking about the fact that tear gas and kinetic impact projectile weapons can lead to death, can lead to permanent injury, can lead to the kind of injury that leads to hospitalization, and that they are crowd control, so they're not targeted in any specific way, that you can aim in a direction, obviously, but you're not aiming for one specific person when you use tear gas. These are the kinds of things that I think make a 2-minute warning reasonable. And so, on that front, I don't think that there's, at least for me, there's not much give on that, because I just think that gives people enough time to leave. I think on the lead-in, I think on the way in which we deal with the warning itself, I think there's plenty of space there to do that in a way that really is collaborative and works in a really specific way. And my hope is that we can get that done. Thank you.
So just to summarize, I hear the 2-minute warning seems to be the toughest one for you, Councilor Arroyo, or unlikely change. The lead in terms of the implementation, there is flexibility and would love some feedback on that. And then the all and implementation for the how the warning is done. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that is accurate. Thank you very much. I think if we were, I think the compromise of not making this a complete ban was creating a warning system that actually allows for people to leave an area. If there is no warning system that allows people to leave the area, then it may as well be a ban at that point, because you're not offering protection to residents and constituents.
Thank you. Going to Councilor Campbell, who's the other co-sponsor, answer questions, whatnot in this second round.
No, well, I will say, I agree with Councilor Arroyo, my co-sponsor on this, right? We've been talking about this for quite some time. And at the end of the day, there was an appetite for many to have a total ban. And what we put forward was something that we thought was incredibly reasonable, given the nature of the work of BPD and what they explained to us were necessary tools for them. And we were hoping, of course, from the beginning that we would have a partnership, or at least a hearing and working sessions where BPD was coming to the table, offering up some concrete suggestions on where we could improve this so that it worked for everyone, including them. But that sounds like it's not necessarily the case. And what I mean by that is that they don't necessarily think this is a good idea to even have some reasonable guidelines in place with respect to these tools. And so I think, it's incumbent upon us, obviously, to lead and to push for these guidelines. I think it doesn't, even passage of this does not, of course, prohibit us from having subsequent conversations with the department if it's in place as to, implementation date, how much time they would need, what some of their current practices are with respect to making sure that folks in a crowd are addressed and all notified. I think that's a larger conversation around our notification process period within the department. But I don't think any of it should preclude us moving forward on this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councilor Campbell. Just looking at the raised hands from my colleagues. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Just responding to Councilor Mejia's comments about, having translators. I'm just translators during a protest. I'm just wondering what impact that would have on the timing. Making sure we have certified translators at the scene. I know the Boston Police in the language access. We do have a few Boston police officers that would speak, say, Cantonese if it was in downtown. So I think that would have to be discussed. Doing an inventory basically of who the speakers are. But I also was kind of wondering what impact that would have on the timing. And then my other question is I heard, during the protest, which was mostly in my district, and had many of the stores were vandalized by a handful of people. But I'm concerned about, what happens when there are a few people that don't come to protest for the right reason, such as the protesters that shot at police at the Boston Common area. What impact does that have on this debate when there are thousands of people that are protesting peacefully, and there's a handful of people that want to add violence to that protest? what role would the police play during that time? What is the time frame? How do we respond to those types of life and death situations? Because the police are there to protect the peaceful protesters and those that are not peacefully protesting. So, I have concerns that there are people that do like to go to these protests, not for the right reasons, and to add an element of violence. But what role will the police department play in that type of situation?
That's to Superintendent McGoldrick.
Yeah. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Yeah, that's to.
Councilor Edwards, could I respond to that, please?
You may after Superintendent McGoldrick. And I saw you raise your hand, so you could just go ahead and respond to the other things as well, Attorney Clear. Superintendent?
I mean, our role would be diminished in terms of the range of options that we have. We would still, as we always do, look out for the safety of the people that are present and protesting, and try to keep the level of conflict as low as possible, recognizing that some people are intent on conflict, as we've seen in the past. But the reality is it's a problem. We would not be as effective. We would not have the range of options that have proven successful and proven to be used in a very limited, very judicious way in the past. So we would be there for the people of Boston, as we always are, and we would intervene as best we could, but it would be limited, and it would be at greater risk to the people present trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. And it would certainly be at much greater risk to the police officers, both physically and in terms of liability. Certainly with this new expected police reform legislation, particularly when you're actually violating an ordinance or alleged to violate an ordinance, everything you do is putting your career and your livelihood on the line. So it's not just the physical risk that the officers would have to absorb, but the additional liability and career risk that we'd have to absorb. So we would be there for the citizens of Boston, but it would be much more challenging.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent. I appreciate that. I know you would be there for the residents of Boston, because I think the Boston police are highly trained and educated, and as someone mentioned, they're also our neighbors and sports coaches and Little League coaches and active in the community. So I appreciate those comments. Jeff, were you interested in responding to that? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
So, as Deputy Superintendent pointed out, this is a restriction on just these weapons. As he said, these weapons have very, very rarely been used during demonstrations. I've been monitoring demonstrations, personally observing them, as has the National Lawyers Guild, for the last 30 years. And the police are always very active in arresting immediately people who are engaged in acts of violence. They don't have to use these weapons. They go in and arrest the individuals. And they are always on the alert for people who are committing acts of violence or property destruction. And they can go in and target those individuals. As you said, Councillor Flynn, there are, for the vast majority of protesters and demonstrators, they are peaceful. There may be a few troublemakers or people who come with the idea of committing violence or property destruction, and the police are on the lookout for them. They've done intelligence work beforehand. They know who troublemakers are often. They can often identify them, and I've seen them over and over again during a peaceful demonstration go in and arrest individuals. So they're not losing any options here in terms of enforcing the law, in terms of stopping violence, in terms of stopping property destruction. They're only being restricted and not banned from, but only restricted in the use of these very dangerous weapons. Superintendent McGoldrick talked about the difference between tear gas, CS gas, and pepper spray. And you should have the letter from the Physicians for Human Rights and a number of other organizations that was sent to the Boston City Council, which details, in fact, the very serious injuries that pepper spray, along with CS gas, can cause to people. It's well documented in the medical literature that in particular with pepper spray, there have been very serious and permanent injuries caused to people's eyes with the use of pepper spray. And it is still an indiscriminate weapon. It's not as bad as tear gas in terms of its dispersal, but unless you're right in front of a person and spraying it on that particular person, it certainly disperses and can cause very serious injuries and permanent injuries to people who are not part of committing any kind of unlawful act or violence or property destruction. And the third thing I wanted to mention was the concerns that Councillor Mejia raised and Councillor Flynn raised about language and access to it. We already have in Massachusetts a riot statute. It's, Superintendent McGoldrick mentioned it. It's Chapter 269, Section 1, in which the police, when people are acting riotously or tumultuously, give an order to disperse and then can arrest people if they refuse to do so. So that's been in place for close to 100 years, that statute, and it has been used in many demonstrations. The police already have procedures for announcing that to the crowd. And I've done a number of these cases, defended people in some of these cases where they've been arrested. And I've done a great deal of research in this area. As far as I can see, there has never been a lawsuit brought against any police officer in the state of Massachusetts because it was not announced in the proper language or not given in sign language. There has never been a criminal case that has been dismissed because it wasn't announced in that. The police already have procedures in place for ordering a crowd to disperse. So there would be the same procedures can be applied to giving the warnings about using these very dangerous weapons. So I don't think the language, certainly the more access people have and the more knowledge they have about this, the better it is. But I don't see that as being any impediment to giving these warnings. They're in place already with this 100-year-old statute about riots and ordering people to disperse from that. So those are the,
yeah. Thank you, Jeff. And I mean, I represent the downtown area and the Chinatown area where the demonstrations were, and I had a lot of businesses in my district that were destroyed during a lot of these demonstrations, and a lot of them were immigrant-owned businesses, which was very hurtful. But I still don't think I have a good answer on when people bring, such as what happened at the Boston Common, when people bring, weapons, they bring knives or they bring guns or water bottles filled with ice. They're out to cause violence and chaos. And all it takes is one person to have such a significant impact on the entire demonstration. I still think we have to answer that question honestly. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell?
Yes, Madam Chair. I actually have to jump. I had a hard stop at 12 for another meeting that I unfortunately cannot reschedule. Councilor Roy, I know, is going to stay on. I will just say, and thank you so much to the panelists for being here and for giving us more of your time. I know how busy you guys are, so thank you so much for your work. I would just say a couple of things. Obviously, looking to get this passed, I do think we have to remember why we're doing this, right? We have heard from thousands of residents via email, text, calls, that they want to see policing reform on a whole host of fronts. including how we show up with respect to our protest, and real concrete stories, painful stories of folks where these tools were used on them. Councillor Bach even spoke to that were really painful to hear. And so Councillor Roy and I obviously came together to find a reasonable response, even though there was an appetite by many for a total ban, to say we want to work with our police department, given the nature of their job, to have a reasonable response. And we, of course, put this forward in August, have been waiting for greater collaboration with the department on some of these provisions. That being said, I still think it is solid. I think there are different pieces we could work out if they decide not to show up now, maybe later on. And then on two other pieces, on this, there was an argument made around suing. Obviously, people can sue our police department at any time for anything that we do. This doesn't create an opportunity for that. If some of these tools were used and folks thought inappropriately or they were harmed, there's avenues they can take. Our goal is to respond to our constituents, to get something done that is reasonable. This is definitely it. And remember, we can always come back once it's in practice to tweak, to edit. We've done that with several ordinances in the past on a whole host of issues where we said, you know what, this is working out differently. Let's tweak, let's edit, let's reform. Happy to do that. But I think we've had a whole host of conversations, and now is the time to get it done to respond to those concerns that we heard. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, of course, to Councilor Royal for the partnership.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask again for one last round for colleagues to raise their hands if they have any other suggestions. Again, I've heard from Councilor Arroyo his thoughts on specific changes and ideas. If anyone has any thoughts about the 2-minute warning, if anyone has any thoughts about the lead-in time, if anyone has any thoughts about the implementation of the all, thank you, Attorney Sir, for the liability implications of that, if there were concerns in your understanding of what has and hasn't happened in terms of lawsuits. Yeah, so I wanted to make sure that we got some feedback on that from any of my other colleagues and the BPD in terms of their thought. It's important because this could very well be something that comes before us publicly this Wednesday to my colleagues. So it would be great if there's any suggestions. I personally, I know this seems like a long time, but I do think a 3-month implementation lead window would be something that I'm interested in. I don't know if the sponsors are interested in that. I'm also wondering if there's an opportunity to pass and study as well, if the counselors would be interested in this, if they would be interested in a form of this, if this is to be brought before us, and if we're to succeed, how do we make sure that this is working? How do we make sure that this is something like we're monitoring it as well, what's going right and going wrong? And would they be interested in that kind of, because we've done this with other statutes as well, other ordinances as well. We make them come back to the council to discuss if it's working, if it's not working, what additional adjustments. We've done this with, while I've been here, as you recall, Councillor Flynn, we made them come back specifically about short-term rentals as a controversy, and we had to have this additional discussion. We've done this before here with the Boston jobs policy. We have that come back and discuss, and that was also discussed recently when discussing the OPAP. So I want to be clear. Sometimes it's the continued discussion that also should be legislated. I have hands that come up right now. I think Councillor Flynn, your hand was already up. That was from before. Am I correct? Or were you raising it again?
I had one follow-up question, if that's okay.
Okay, so in order of the hands that came up, Councillor Flynn, in order of the hands that came up, it was Councillor Mejia, Councillor Arroyo, and then I saw your hand again. Okay, so Councillor Mejia, Councillor Arroyo, and Councillor Flynn.
Yes, so I wanted to recommend perhaps instead of 2 minutes, could we do 3 minutes? A little bit more time might give us an opportunity to address a lot of the concerns that we're talking about in terms of who is able to understand what is happening here and what is about to go down. So maybe extending the warning time. And then I'm also curious in terms of the rollout with the 3-month situation, can we add in terms of, will there be training and information sharing with the officers in terms of these new protocols? What provisions are we putting in place to ensure that people understand what this is going to look like moving forward? And then Councilor Edwards, I really like your whole idea of, testing things out to see how it fits and then working out the tweaks. I think that seems pretty reasonable. And just one last thing that I want to say is that, we talk about the BPD having systems in place to communicate with communities that speak languages other than English. But, I think that what we have seen, and especially in certain and recent incidences, I'll point to the one in East Boston that happened in March. That police officer that was stationed in East Boston didn't speak Spanish, and there was a lack of communication there. So whatever that looks like, I just think it needs to be really explicit, and that there's a level of accountability that happens. And I think one of the other sessions I talked about having a dashboard. I'd like to know how often these things get dispersed and what the outcomes have been of that in terms of people getting hurt. If there's a way for us to keep track of those things, that would be incredibly helpful as well.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And I do believe the ordinance as proposed does have some research or some collection of data in it. Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to touch on a couple things. I think the 3-month lead-in is wholly appropriate, and I think that's something that, in speaking with Councilor Campbell, I think that's something that can be added. As far as the 2 minutes, I think what Councilor Mejia has illustrated is that, there's a wide range of what people think is an appropriate amount of time. For some folks who've been advocating for this bill, they didn't want warnings. They just didn't want this to be used at all. They didn't think that it should happen. And I think it's important to understand that that's a part of the conversation, is that there's a large part of the city that would have preferred that we not allow for the usage of this at all. When we came to the 2 minutes, the idea was to give somebody who's elderly, somebody who has young children, somebody who may be trying to leave, the actual ability to leave. I think there's folks outside of the construct of this room, this Zoom chat rather, who would see 2 minutes as either too long or too short. And so when we came up to 2 minutes, we thought that was a solid compromise, on top of the fact that we're already compromising with the fact that we're not removing these weapons' ability to be used. But I think that Councilor Mejia just kind of illustrated the difficulties in trying to find a specific, number that works well. And, without BPD having ever really offered a time frame in a written amendment form, 2 minutes is kind of what we have. And I think that it's a good middle ground from folks who believe it shouldn't exist at all to folks who think it should be 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Or, we've had advocates who've asked for why just 2 sets of warnings? Why not 4 sets of warnings? Now, why 5 sets of warnings? And so I would just say that it's both sides. There's a conversation about it being too long, but there's also an extended amount of pressure to make that time longer. And so I that's why we came to 2 minutes. We think it's somewhere in the middle, but I think the 3-minute lead-in is wholly appropriate and something that we can get in there.
Okay, thank you very much, Councilor Arroyo. And I actually was reminded, if the state, where there would be a conflict between this and the State House and where it would require us to change, and that would be if the State House, for example, had passed I think there was a bill proposed during the budget debate about banning tear gas altogether. And there was a back and forth. If you recall, I think it was, I don't know if it was Rep. Miranda, but somebody had proposed banning tear gas. Now, if the State House had banned that and we were only restricting here at city level, then we would have to come under the State House and the ban would reach down to us. But that's not what happened, is my understanding. So I just want to be, for those who had asked about that. Councilor Flynn, Councilor Sabi George, just seeing you, I went through a second round. I wasn't sure if you had anything. after Counselor Flynn.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I've been in and out, so I don't feel comfortable asking additional questions. Thank you.
I understand. Thank you. Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Council Edwards. I guess one of my final points is, if this was to take place, will there be a financial cost to it for the city to implement these proposed changes? And if that is the case, are we going to advocate for that in the city budget, or will the Boston Police make these changes with the ongoing budget that they have? So I want to know, I'd like to see what impact it would have on the city budget and in future budget for the police. But also, and then my final point is, I'd also like to see about any cities and towns across the country that have implemented this, lessons learned, what went well, what didn't go well, what challenges they had, what was the community and neighborhood process, and learn from those lessons. So I would like to have the opportunity to at least see about other major cities across the country that have implemented this type of a program and what the results were. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Councilor Edwards, I think you might be on mute.
I was absolutely on mute, Counselor Flynn. Thank you. I think that's why I'm really interested in the lead-in time, Counselor Flynn. That's why I didn't want it to immediately start. And I do believe that there's a certain balance that the co-sponsors have tried to strike with folks, not banning these things, but saying there could be some restrictions we could all agree to. I genuinely have heard that several times, wanting to have a collaborative conversation about restrictions we all could agree to. If we also had a lead-in time, I think also that allows for us to continue to have the conversation, research, and concerns. We are not, this isn't going to be written in stone. We also could be one day discussing adjustments that we may need to have. We've adjusted other policies is all I'm saying. So I just wanted people to know that as well. For any other colleagues who have any other questions, remarks, suggestions for this particular docket, please raise your blue hand. And to the advocates and to the Boston Police Department, if you have any other suggestions, comments, including remarks for this particular docket, please raise your blue hands. If nobody raises their blue hands, I am going to conclude this working session. I knew it. Okay. All right. So, and Attorney Fleur has raised his hand. Go ahead, Attorney Fleur. So sorry if I've mispronounced your name the entire time. I apologize.
Not a problem. Okay. I just want to echo what Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Campbell have said, which is it's time for us to seriously look at police reform legislation. This is one small step toward doing it, restricting the use of these very significantly dangerous weapons. And it would be great to see the city of Boston be a leader in that. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Superintendent McGoldrick or any other folks?
Thank you, Council. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this working group. I think, as I've tried to convey during this meeting, is our interest is in protecting the people who come to Boston to exercise their First Amendment rights, and the businesses that are impacted if there are crowds that engage in property damage, and the people that are impacted when crowds engage in violence. That happens extremely rarely, and it's handled very well by the Boston Police Department. We have guidelines and protocols in place, and you know, we take on this work at great risk. We still have officers that are out injured with their lives, still impacted by the injuries they received at some of these riots. So, you know, we literally go out there and put our own well-being on the line, with no intent to use any force greater than that which is necessary. But we also seek to apply our experience and our judgment and that of the people that lead this department. And I think we've done so very well. There's a lot in this ordinance that is going to limit our ability to do just that. And it still remains, in my view, as written, a very problematic ordinance for the police department. You know, as I said, if it becomes the law of the land, certainly we'll abide by it, we'll train to it, and we'll make it work as best we can. But our ability will be diminished, and the additional risk that we ask our officers to take on at these events will increase for them, and unfortunately probably increase for people who just want to go there and have their message heard. You know, it's not just the police that are at risk, it's everyone. So I mean, those are the reasons why we see the problems with this ordinance as written, in addition to the fact that there's probably going to be a state solution that would apply more broadly, and I think would be more than effective at adding a level of scrutiny and oversight on these issues. But thank you for allowing me to participate. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. With that, those concluding remarks, no additional blue hands, I'm going to conclude this working session. I want to thank everyone for participating. I think we've been very clear about what areas we were concerned about, and the co-sponsors will hopefully get us some drafted language that address that. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.